In this video, we will talk about factoring trinomials, which means three terms, anything in the form of three terms, when a is different from 1. And the method we're going to be using in this video is the grouping method. Now, there are other methods, but the first method I would like to discuss with you is the grouping method. So what do we do if we have an a in front of the x squared? In order to factor something like this, where x squared has a coefficient, we need to start by multiplying the a and the c. So a times c in this case is a negative 36. So what I need to do is to find those two numbers that multiply to give me negative 36 and add to give me the b, which is negative 5. So put a plus sign on top of the negative 5. And put a dot on top of AC. So two numbers that multiply to give me negative 36 and add to give me negative 5, which is the B. So two numbers that multiply to give me AC, A times C, and add to give me B. Now, in order to find those two numbers, you need to list all of the factors of negative 36. Now, you might be good with numbers and be able to figure it right away, or you might need to list a couple of factors until you find it. So let's start with 1 and 36. Now, 1 times 36 is positive 36, so I need one of them to be a negative. Now, this will multiply to give me negative 36, but I need them to add to give me a negative 5. So let's add negative 1 and 36. That will give me 35. So that is not my choice. Now another number is 2 times 18. 2 times 18 is a 36, and I need one of them to be a negative. Now let's add negative 2 plus 18. That will give me 16. And I don't want that. I want negative 5. So let's move on. Let's think of the number 3. So 3 times 12 is a 36. So negative 3 times 12 is a negative 36. But they add to give me 9. So you see how I'm getting closer? So that's not what I want. So let's move on. 4 times 9 is 36. But I need one of them to be negative. So negative 4 times 9 is negative 36. Now they add to give me a positive 5. I need a negative 5. I got the number, but not the sign. So what I need to do is just switch the sign. So 4, negative 9. So 4 times negative 9 is a negative 36. And if I add 4 and negative 9, that will give me a negative 5. So these are my two numbers, negative 9 and 4. After I find the two numbers, I split the middle term, which is in this case a negative 5x. I split this term into two terms. One of them is the negative 9x, and the second one is the 4x. Where did I get the negative 9 from and the 4 from? These are the two numbers I found. These are the two numbers that multiply to give me negative 36 and added to give me negative 5. So I copy the first, turn down. I split the middle term, which is negative 5, into the two numbers I found, which are negative 9 and positive 4. And I copy down the constant, which is negative 6. Now after I do that and I write down all the four terms now, I group the first two together, which is 6x to the power 2 minus 9x. I copy down the sign, which is a positive, and I group 4x minus 6. Now from here, this is just a GCF problem. You look at those two terms that you have grouped, and you ask yourself, what's common between them? I can see that 6 is divisible by 3, 9 is divisible by 3, so 3 is a common factor. X to the power 2 and x. So x is a common factor. You always take the variable with the lower power. If it's x, it means it's x to the power 1. So 3x is in common. So if you divide 6 by 3, you are left with 2. It's x to the power 2, and you factored an x out, so only one x is left. Negative 9x, so negative 9 divided by 3 is a 3. Now the x is factored out, so there is no x left over here. This is how you factor the first two terms. Now let's move on to the next two terms. What's common between them? 4 is an even number, 6 is an even number, so there's a 2 in common. 4x has an x, but 6 has no x, so there's no x in common. So the only thing in common between these two terms is a 2. So 4 divided by 2 is a 2. Since I did not factor the x, so I copy it down. I copy down the minus, and then 6 divided by 2 is a 3. So this is how you find the GCF out of those two terms. Now, if you are doing everything right, the two terms inside the parentheses will be exactly the same. So it's 2x minus 3 and 2x minus 3. What you do after that is that you write down that the factor, the first factor, is going to be 2x minus 3. There you go. And the second factor is going to be the two terms on the outside, which is 3x plus 2. So those will create your first factor, and the 2x minus 3 will create my second factor. Okay? So then my factored form is 3x plus 2 and 2x minus 3. A common mistake that students do is that they look over here and they see that there is 2x minus 3. So they put 2x minus 3 to the power 2. Now that is wrong, because like what you think about is that 2x minus 3 is in this term, so, and it's also in here, so there's something in common, which is the 2x minus 3. And then the 3x and the 2 create your second factor. It doesn't matter how you write it, so if you write it as 2x minus 3 into 3x plus 2, that would be also correct. Now let's move on to the example over here where I gave you all the steps. Now I would like you to pause the video and try this one on your own. Now the first thing I need to do is to find what A times C is. So A is 12 and C is 2. So A times C is a 24. And so I need the factors of 24 that would add up to the B. The B is a negative 11 and add up to negative 11. So I need two numbers that would multiply to give me 24 and add up to give me negative 11. So something that will multiply to give me those and add to give me the middle term. Now, for me to find those numbers, let's think of all the factors that make up 24. So what multiplies to give me 24? 1 and 24. But if you add them, you will get 25. So that is not what I want. What else multiplies to give me 24? 2 and 12. 2 times 12 is a 24. But if I add them, that will give me 14. You see, I'm getting closer. So that's not it. But then I realized that every time I'm using those numbers, I'm getting positive numbers. But 11 is negative. So that means whatever choice I put over here, it has to add up to a negative number. So what multiplies to give me 24? So now, to get a positive 24, you have to multiply two negative numbers, because negative 2 times negative 12, negative and a negative, if you multiply them, that will give you a positive, and that's positive 24. So if I add those two numbers, I get negative 14. So that's not what I want still. Okay, what else multiplies to give me 24? 3 times 8 multiplies to give me 24. And they add up to give me 11. You see how the number is there, but it's negative? So that means if 3 times 8 is a 24, I know that negative 3 times negative 8 is also a positive 24, because negative times negative is a positive. Now when I add negative 3 and negative 8, that would give me negative 11. So there you go, I got what they wanted. And the two numbers are negative 3 and negative 8. So I found the two numbers. Now what do I do after that? I copy the first term down. I split the middle term into those two numbers. So instead of negative 11, I need to write negative 3x minus 8x. And I copy the constant down. That's called the grouping method, okay? Because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to group the first two together and the last two together and try to find the GCF and factor the GCF out for each of those two. So if I look at 12x to the power 2 and negative 3x, I know that 12 is divisible by 3. If I divide 12 by 3, I will get a 4. And I know 3 divided by 3 is a 1. So let's factor 3 out. If you factor 3 out, 12 divided by 3 is a 3 minus 3 divided by 3 is a 1. So I'm going to put a 1 over here. Now let's think about the x's. Now this is x to the power 2 and this is x. So this is a double x, like not double x, basically it's x times x. And this is just x. So there is an x in common. 12 has x to the power 2. If I factor an x out, there's an x left. Now this has an x, but I factored the x out, so this will have no x. Do you see how I factored the whole thing out? So I don't put a 0 over here. I always put 1, because if I want to FOIL or distribute, it should give me exactly this. So 3 times 3 is not 12, so I made a mistake over here. This should be a 4. Okay, so 12 divided by 3 is 4. So see how it's always good for you to check. We all make mistakes, so always double check by distributing. So 3 times 4 is 12. X times x is x squared. 3x times negative 1, that's your negative 3x. Now, if you look at those two, I can see that 8 is even, 2 is even, so both of them are divisible by 2. But do you see how the first term has a negative in front of it? If that happens, if the first number in the parentheses is a negative, always factor the negative out. So then negative 2 is in common. So negative 8 divided by negative 2 is a positive 4, so 4x. Now 2 divided by negative 2 is a negative 1. Now remember, you can use, if you have access to your calculator, you can divide on your calculator. So 2 divided by negative 2 is a negative 1. Always distribute to double check. Negative 2 times 4x, that's negative 8x. Negative 2 times negative 1 is a positive 2. Now how can I know if I did the right thing? Let's look inside the parentheses. Are they exactly the same? Yes. So that would be my first factor. My second factor is going to be those GCF I took on the outside along with the sign. So that would be 3x minus 2. And that's how you factor using the grouping method. Now please pause the video and try this one on your own. Just remember, check if there's a GCF first. Factor out the GCF and then factor the trinomial using the grouping method, since I didn't teach you any other method yet. Now I hope you tried this problem on your own. Now let's start by factoring out the GCF. Now how did I know that there's a GCF? If I look closer at the A, that's an even number. The B is also an even number. The C is an even number. So it looks like there's a 2 common between them. So I'm going to take 2 as a GCF. Now 8 divided by 2 is a 4, so that's 4x to the power 2. 8x divided by 2, that's a 4x. And negative 30 divided by 2, that's a negative 15. Now let me check if there is anything else in common. This has an x to the power 2. This has a variable x. This does not have a variable, it's a constant. So there's no x in common. Now let's look at the numbers one more time to make sure I factored everything correctly. Now this is an even number, even, this is odd. So 4 and 4 and negative 15, there's nothing else in common. So 2 is my only GCF. Now, let's look closer at the trinomial that's inside the parentheses. I can see that this is a trinomial where a is not 1. So, I can use the grouping method to try to factor this. So I first start by multiplying a times c. So let's recognize what a is, which is 4, b is a 4, and the c is a negative 15. I need two numbers that would multiply to give me a times c, which is 4 times negative 15 in this case, and that's a negative 60. And I need two numbers that would add to give me the b, which is in this case a 4. So remember to find as many factors as you can for negative 60. So you would find those two numbers that would add to a 4. So what multiplies to give me negative 60? I can directly jump to 6 and 10, because I know 6 times 10 is 60. And since it's a negative 60, then one of those numbers, the 10 and the 6, has to be a negative. So 6 times 10 is a 60. I want a negative 60, so I'm going to put one of them to be the negative. 6 times negative 10 is a negative 60 now. Now if I add those two numbers, that will give me a negative 4, which is not what I want. I want positive 4. So I just switch the sign for those two numbers. Now negative 6 times 10, that's negative 60, and negative 6 plus 10, that's a positive 4. So these are my two numbers. After I find the two numbers, I can use different methods to continue factoring. But we're going to be using the grouping method now. So what I do is I copy down the first term. I'm going to split the middle term into those two numbers. So negative 6x, don't forget the x, and plus 10x. Because look guys, if you combine those two terms, negative 6x plus 10x, you will get 4x. So you're not really changing the expression. And now copy down the constant, negative 15. Now, I didn't forget about the 2. We'll come back to it later. So once I factor the trinomial, I can put 2 in front of the factors that I find at the end, okay? But don't forget about the 2. Now let's move on. I group the first two and the last two terms, and I try to find the GCF between these two terms. So 4 and 6, I can see that there's a 2 in common. This is an x to the power 2, and this is an x, so there is an x in common. 4 divided by 2 is a 2. And since I factored x out of the x to the power 2, so there's an x left. Don't forget to copy the sign, which is a minus in this case. 6 divided by 2 is a 3. Now, there's an x over here, but I factored it out, so there's no x that goes with the 3. And that's how you find the GCF. Now let's move on to the next two terms, to the next binomial. 10x minus 15. 10 is divisible by 5. 15 is divisible by 5. This has an x, but this does not have an x. So the only GCF in this case is a positive 5. Now, why did I write positive 5? Because the sign of the first term in this parentheses is a positive. So that's why this is a positive 5. Now, open parentheses. 10 divided by 5, that's 2, so 2x. Minus 15 divided by 5 is a 3. Now, let's check. This and this binomial, they are exactly the same. So that means I have taken the GCF correctly. Now, I still have one more step, which is to take the GCF, 2x plus 5, as one of your factors. And then the common factor over here, which is 2x minus 3, will be your second factor. And you write it only once. You don't put to the power 2 over here, because this is a common factor, so I write it down once. And that's how you factor this trinomial. Now, don't forget to copy down the GCF that you have taken out earlier, which is a 2 in this case. And now this is how you factor such a trinomial. Now, how can you check your work? One way is to actually distribute the 2 and then to FOIL whatever you get over here. Now, if you have access to a calculator, you can put the original standard form or the original equation in y1 and your factored equation in y2 and graph it. If you see the same parabola or the same graph, then you have factored correctly. If you see two different graphs, then that means that you have made a mistake somewhere, and you can go back and check your work. And that's the end of the grouping method.